2016, when my father did not return from the sump and no one came to tell us why. My name is Joran Vale, and I have lived my entire life in the lower reaches of Acanthos Prime, a hive city that stretches so far into the clouds that I have never seen the sky. The levels where I was born exist in a perpetual twilight, lit only by the failing luminators that flicker against walls slick with condensation and the orange glow of waste incinerators that burn without ceasing. The air here tastes of metal and rot, a combination so familiar that I no longer notice it except when I wake gasping from dreams of clean water and open spaces that I have never known. My father worked the sump levels as a waste hauler, and when he disappeared, I inherited his ration chip, his HAB unit assignment, and his place in the rotation that keeps the hive from drowning in its own filth. No ceremony marked this transition. No official came to explain his absence or offer condolences. There was only the sharp-faced administrator who updated my identification tattoo and told me to report to the collection depot before the next shift bell or forfeit my family's water allowance. That was 7 years ago, and I have hauled waste every day since. The work is simple in its brutality. Each morning, when the shift klaxons sound through the HAB blocks like the wailing of some mechanical god, I rise from the thin pallet I share with my younger sister Mira and make my way through corridors so narrow that two people cannot pass without turning sideways. The walls here are not the clean plasteel of the upper levels but ancient ferrocrete, stained black with centuries of grime and spotted with patches of toxic mold that blooms in patterns resembling human faces. I have learned which patches to avoid touching, which corners harbor the nests of sump rats large enough to strip flesh from bone, and which HAB units have been quietly abandoned after their occupants failed to wake one morning. The architecture of the lower levels is not designed but accumulated, layer upon layer of makeshift repairs and improvised expansions that have transformed what might once have been planned infrastructure into a labyrinth of collapsing passages and forgotten spaces. Entire sections have been walled off after structural failures, their inhabitants left to whatever fate awaited them in the darkness, and no one speaks of these places except in whispers that die quickly in the perpetual hum of ventilation fans. The HAB unit I share with Mira measures 3 meters by 4, a space barely large enough for our sleeping pallets, a small heating unit that functions intermittently, and a chemical toilet that empties into the waste system below. We have no running water in the unit itself. For that, we must walk to the communal dispensary 2 levels down, where residents queue for hours to fill containers from rusted taps that deliver liquid the color of weak tea and tasting of industrial byproducts. The water is supposed to be filtered and purified according to Administratum standards, but those standards were written for hive levels far above ours, and the filtration systems that service the lower reaches have not been properly maintained in decades. People fall sick regularly from waterborne pathogens, their bodies racked by fevers and digestive failures, and the Medicaid facilities that might treat such ailments are reserved for workers in essential industries, a category that does not include waste haulers or the unemployed masses who make up the majority of the lower-level population. Our walls are thin enough that I can hear everything that happens in the adjacent HAB units. The crying of infants who go hungry because their parents cannot afford supplemental rations, the arguments between couples driven to desperation by unemployment and the constant fear of losing their housing assignments, the wet, rattling coughs of those afflicted with lung rot, a degenerative condition caused by prolonged exposure to the chemical-laden air that circulates through our ventilation systems. Sometimes I hear sounds that I cannot identify, mechanical whirring or scraping that seems to come from within the walls themselves, and I wonder if servitors move through hidden passages, performing maintenance tasks that no human would survive, or if the sounds are simply the settling of ancient infrastructure stressed beyond its design tolerances. Mira is 12 years old, and she has never known any life other than this. She does not attend Schola, because education in the lower levels is limited to the children of foremen and security personnel, and even then it consists primarily of basic literacy and indoctrination in imperial dogma. She spends her days in the HAB unit or roaming the corridors with other children, scavenging for anything that might be sold or traded for extra food. She is small for her age, her growth stunted by malnutrition, and her skin has the pale, almost translucent quality that comes from never seeing natural sunlight. I try to protect her as much as I can, saving portions of my own rations to supplement hers, teaching her which areas to avoid and which people cannot be trusted. But I know that my protection is limited, that there are dangers I cannot shield her from, and that eventually she will have to navigate this world on her own. The thought terrifies me more than I can express. The collection depot sits at the junction of 5 major waste channels, a cavernous space carved from the Hive's foundation where the refuse of 10 million souls converges before being sorted, compressed, and fed into the incinerators that keep the toxic buildup from overwhelming the lower levels entirely. The depot is overseen by Foreman Kalach, a man whose face has been half replaced by a crude augmetic that clicks and whirs when he speaks, a punishment or repair from some long-ago accident that he never explains. The augmetic is not the clean, sophisticated work of the Adeptus Mechanicus, but a brutish assemblage of metal plates and exposed wiring that gives him the appearance of something caught between human and machine. One of his eyes has been replaced with a lens that glows faintly red in dim light, and his jaw moves with a mechanical precision that makes every word sound clipped and artificial. He stands on a platform above the sorting floor and calls out assignments with a voice distorted by damaged vocal synthesizers, directing teams of haulers to different sectors based on the overnight accumulation reports that scroll across flickering data slates. The depot floor is a chaos of activity even at the earliest hours. Massive conveyor belts run constantly, carrying loads of compressed refuse toward the incinerators, and the air is thick with steam and the acrid smell of burning plastic. Servitors move among the haulers, their lobotomized brains capable only of following simple programmed instructions, lifting and sorting with mechanical efficiency. Some of these servitors were once human, criminals or debtors who failed to meet their obligations and were repurposed by the Mechanicus, and I try not to look too closely at their faces, at the vacant expressions and the surgical scars that mark where personality and memory were excised. The haulers themselves are a mix of hereditary workers like me, those who inherited their positions from deceased parents, and conscripts, individuals assigned to waste collection as punishment for minor infractions, or simply because the Administratum needed to fill quotas. Most mornings, I am assigned to Sector 9 Gamma, a residential zone 3 levels below my own hab unit, where the population density is so extreme that families of 8 or more share spaces barely large enough for sleeping. The waste from these areas is the worst, a combination of human excrement, discarded food packaging, chemical runoff from illegal still operations, and the occasional corpse that no one claimed or reported. Bodies are more common than one might think in the lower levels. People die from disease, from violence, from simple exhaustion, and their families often lack the resources to pay for proper disposal. So the corpses are wrapped in whatever material is available and deposited in the waste chutes, where they become our responsibility. We are supposed to report such findings to the enforcers, but most haulers have learned that filing reports only invites scrutiny and delays, so we simply collect the bodies along with everything else and let the incinerators handle the problem. We work in teams of 4, dragging massive plasteel bins through corridors that were never meant to accommodate them, our backs bent under the weight and our lungs burning with the fumes that rise from the refuse we collect. My team consists of Harrow, a man twice my age whose arms are covered in the scars of acid burns and rat bites; Kale, barely 14, and so thin that his ribs show through his work coveralls; and Senna, a woman in her 30s who never speaks and whose eyes hold a distance that suggests she has seen things that broke something fundamental inside her. Harrow has worked the waste for nearly 3 decades, and his body shows the accumulated damage of that service. His hands are gnarled and twisted, several fingers missing from encounters with sorting machinery, and he walks with a pronounced limp that he never explains. Kale is newer to the work, having been assigned to hauling only 6 months ago when his mother died and left him responsible for his 3 younger siblings. The pressure of that responsibility shows in his face, in the deep circles under his eyes, and the way his hands shake when he thinks no one is watching. We do not talk while we work except to coordinate the lifting and turning required to maneuver the bins through tight spaces, and during the brief rest periods that Foreman Kolach allows, we sit in silence and drink the thin, metallic tasting water that is distributed from communal taps. There is no camaraderie among the haulers, no shared sense of purpose or unity. We are bound together only by necessity and the knowledge that any one of us could vanish at any moment, replaced by another desperate soul who needs the ration chip more than they fear the work. Trust is a luxury we cannot afford, because the Administratum encourages informants, offering small rewards for reports of seditious talk or suspicious behavior, and there is always someone desperate enough to betray a colleague for an extra week's rations or the promise of reassignment to less dangerous work. The people who live in the sectors we service do not acknowledge us. We are invisible to them, part of the infrastructure like the ventilation ducts and drainage pipes, and they go about their daily routines as though we do not exist. I have hauled waste from the same HAB units for years and could not tell you the names or faces of their occupants, because they do not look at us and we do not look at them. This mutual blindness is a survival mechanism, I think, a way of maintaining the fiction that we are somehow different from one another, that their poverty is not our poverty, that the line separating haulers from residents is anything more than arbitrary assignment. But the truth is that we are all the same, all trapped in the lower levels by circumstances of birth and the Imperium's infinite indifference, and the only real difference is that haulers see the full scope of the decay, while residents can pretend it exists somewhere else. The decay is everywhere, visible in every surface and structure. The ferrocrete walls are shot through with cracks that leak moisture and harbor colonies of fungus that pulse with bioluminescent light. The floor grates are rusted through in places, revealing glimpses of the sump levels below where wastewater collects in stagnant pools and things move in the darkness. The luminators flicker constantly, their failing power cells unable to maintain steady output, and entire corridors can be plunged into darkness for hours or days until maintenance crews, if they come at all, manage to restore function. The ventilation systems rattle and wheeze, pushing air that smells of industrial solvents and human waste. And in some sections, the air is so toxic that haulers must wear rebreathers salvaged from dead workers or purchased at exorbitant prices from black market traders who operate in the shadowed alcoves between residential blocks. The lower levels operate according to rules that are never written but universally understood. You do not report injuries because medical services are reserved for productive workers in essential industries, and waste hauling is not considered essential. You do not complain about living conditions because the enforcers who maintain order in these depths are not interested in grievances and respond to disruption with violence that is swift and disproportionate. You do not form organizations or attempt collective action because the Administratum views such activities as sedition, and the punishment for sedition is immediate execution followed by the forfeiture of your family's ration privileges. You do not ask questions about the people who disappear, the HAB units that are suddenly sealed, or the work crews that are sometimes conscripted without explanation and never seen again. And above all, you do not speak against the Imperium, because even in these forgotten depths, there are always those who listen and report in exchange for small favors, extra rations, or the promise of transfer to a higher level that never materializes. The enforcers who patrol our levels are different from the security forces that maintain order in the upper hive. They do not wear the polished carapace armor or carry the sophisticated weaponry of their better-equipped counterparts. Instead, they are outfitted with older patterns of flak armor, scavenged and repaired so many times that no two suits match, and they carry stub guns, shock moles, and occasionally autoguns of questionable reliability. Many of them are recruited from the lower levels themselves, individuals who proved useful as informants or demonstrated a willingness to brutalize their neighbors in exchange for better living conditions and exemption from the labor rotations. They are not soldiers in any meaningful sense. They are thugs with official sanction, and their primary function is not to protect residents but to ensure compliance and suppress any hint of organized resistance. I have witnessed their methods firsthand. 3 years ago, a group of unemployed workers in Sector 8 Delta attempted to organize a protest demanding better food distribution and access to medical care. They were not revolutionaries or heretics, simply desperate people who had watched their children starve and decided that they could no longer remain silent. The protest lasted less than an hour before the enforcers arrived in force, supported by combat servitors equipped with riot suppression weapons. The enforcers opened fire without warning, cutting down protesters with disciplined volleys of autogun fire, and the servitors moved through the crowd methodically, crushing anyone who tried to flee with massive power fists. The killing continued until the corridor was carpeted with bodies, and then the enforcers dragged the corpses to the nearest waste chute and disposed of them as though they were garbage. No investigation followed. No one was held accountable. The official record, such as it was, simply noted that a minor disturbance had been resolved and order restored. The message was clear. We exist only at the sufferance of powers that do not care whether we live or die. I have lived by these rules my entire life, and they have kept me alive. I have kept my head down, performed my work without complaint, avoided drawing attention from authorities or neighbors who might inform on me. I have accepted the daily humiliations and indignities as the price of survival, telling myself that endurance is its own form of victory, that simply continuing to exist in the face of such overwhelming pressure is a kind of resistance. But recently, I have begun to question whether survival without dignity is worth the cost, whether the preservation of biological function in the absence of meaning constitutes life in any sense that matters. The question haunts me during the long hours of hauling, when my body moves automatically and my mind is free to wander. But 3 weeks ago, something changed. It began with a smell, subtle at first, beneath the usual stench of waste and chemical decay. I noticed it while hauling from a hab block in the deepest section of Sector 9 Gamma, a building so old that its original designation had been worn away and replaced with crude gang markings. The building was one of the oldest structures in this sector, dating back to the Hive's earliest expansion phases, and its architecture reflected the brutal functionality of that era. The corridors were barely 2 meters high, forcing taller residents to stoop, and the walls were raw ferrocrete with no covering or decoration. Moisture seeped constantly from cracks in the ceiling, collecting in puddles that harbored mosquito larvae and other parasites, and the air was so saturated with humidity that breathing felt like drowning. The smell was organic and sweet, like fruit left to ferment, but with an underlying note of corruption that made my stomach clench. I mentioned it to Harrow, who only shrugged and said that someone had probably died and not been discovered yet, a common enough occurrence that it barely merited comment. But as we worked through the block, hauling refuse from the central collection chutes, I noticed that entire floors were dark, their luminators extinguished or removed, and the usual sounds of habitation were absent. No voices filtered through the thin walls, no footsteps echoed in the stairwells, no crying of children or arguments between neighbors. The silence was complete, and it felt wrong in a way I could not articulate. In the lower levels, silence is rare. There are always sounds, the constant background noise of too many people living in too little space, and the absence of that noise suggests either abandonment or something worse. When I mentioned this to Foreman Kulach, he told me to focus on my work and not waste time on speculation. His augmetic eye focused on me with unnerving intensity, and his mechanical jaw clicked as he spoke, and I understood that the topic was not open for discussion. I nodded and returned to my hauling, but the unease remained, a knot in my chest that tightened with each passing hour. The next day, we were reassigned. Sector 9 Gamma was removed from the collection rotation without explanation, and our team was sent instead to Sector 12 Beta, a residential zone on the periphery of the waste processing district. The reassignment was unusual enough to draw murmurs from the other haulers, but no one questioned it directly. We had learned long ago that questions were dangerous, that the safest response to irregularity was acceptance and silence. But I could not stop thinking about the silent hab block, about the smell that had permeated its corridors, about the way the darkness had seemed to press against my vision like something alive and hungry. That night, lying on my pallet while Mira slept beside me, I asked her if she had heard anything about Sector 9 Gamma, whether any of the residents in our building had family or connections there. She looked at me with eyes too old for her 12 years and told me that asking questions like that was how people ended up on the enforcer lists, and that I should be grateful for the work I had and not invite trouble. Her voice was quiet but firm, and I recognized in it the same resignation that I heard from every resident of the lower levels, the acceptance that this was simply how things were, and that resistance or inquiry would only bring suffering. She was right, of course. But the unease remained, growing stronger with each passing day. Over the following days, I began to notice patterns that I had previously ignored or attributed to the normal chaos of life in the lower levels. Certain sectors would be removed from the collection rotation with increasing frequency, always the deepest and most densely populated areas, and always without official explanation. The haulers who had worked those sectors would be reassigned, or, in some cases, would simply fail to report for their shifts, their absence noted only by the appearance of new workers who asked no questions about their predecessors. When I tried to inquire about what had happened to these missing haulers, I was met with blank stares or hurried denials, as though even acknowledging their existence was dangerous. The population of the lower levels seemed to be contracting, not through the usual attrition of disease and starvation, but through something more deliberate and coordinated. Entire hab blocks would go dark, their power cut, and their entrances sealed with heavy plasteel barriers marked with imperial aquillas and warnings about structural instability. And yet, the buildings themselves showed no signs of collapse, no visible damage that would justify their abandonment. The seals were clean and professional, the kind of work performed by specialized engineering crews rather than emergency response teams, and the warnings posted on the barriers cited vague concerns about load-bearing capacity and foundation integrity without providing specific details or timelines for repairs. I began to listen more carefully to the conversations around me, the whispered exchanges between haulers during rest periods, and the rumors that circulated through the communal water stations. What I heard was fragmentary and contradictory, filtered through layers of fear and speculation, but a picture began to emerge. The Administratum, it was said, had determined that certain sections of the lower levels were no longer viable, that the cost of maintaining them exceeded their productive value, and that the population needed to be consolidated to more efficient areas. The word consolidation was used frequently, spoken with a mix of dread and dark humor, and no one seemed entirely certain what it meant in practical terms. Some said that residents were being relocated to labor camps in the Underhive, sent to work the toxic refineries and mining operations that sustain the Hive's industry. Others claimed that the sealed hab blocks were simply being left to die, their inhabitants trapped inside until starvation or disease claimed them, a form of disposal that required no resources and left no witnesses. And a few, speaking in voices barely above a whisper, suggested something worse, that the sealed sectors were being used for purposes that no one dared to name, that the Imperium had uses for human bodies that did not require them to be alive, that servitor production or worse awaited those who disappeared into the darkness. I did not know what to believe, but I knew that the fear was real. I could see it in the faces of my fellow haulers, in the way they avoided certain topics and changed subjects when enforcers passed nearby. I could feel it in the tension that had settled over the lower levels like a fog, making every interaction fraught with suspicion and every silence pregnant with unspoken dread. People moved through their routines with mechanical precision, avoiding eye contact and speaking only when necessary, and the communal spaces that had once hosted quiet conversations and small gestures of solidarity now stood empty, except for those who had no choice but to use them. The fear grew heavier with each passing day, a physical weight that pressed down on my chest and made breathing difficult. It was Kale who first spoke openly about the vanishings. We were hauling from Sector 12 Beta, working through a hab block that reeked of chemical fires and human waste, when he suddenly stopped and leaned against the wall, his breath coming in short gasps. I thought at first that he was simply exhausted, that the work had finally exceeded his young body's capacity. But when I approached him, I saw that he was crying. Tears streaked through the grime on his face, leaving clean tracks, and his hands trembled as he pressed them against the ferrocrete. I asked him what was wrong. keeping my voice low so that Harrow and Senna would not hear, and he told me that his older brother had lived in Sector 9 Gamma, in the same hab block where I had smelled the sweetness of decay. His brother had been a machinist, employed in one of the small workshops that repaired servitors and maintained the ventilation systems that kept the lower levels habitable. He had been reliable and careful, the kind of person who followed every rule and never drew attention, who paid his tithes on time and kept his identification tattoo clean and legible. He had 3 children and a wife who worked in the textile mills on level 47, and he had been saving for years to afford medical treatment for his youngest daughter, who had been born with a respiratory defect that made breathing painful and labored. Kale described his brother as the most responsible person he knew, someone who took care of his family and his obligations with equal seriousness, and then one day he had simply stopped coming home. Kale had gone to the enforcers to report him missing, as was required by Administratum protocol, and they had told him that his brother had been transferred to another sector for reassignment, that no further information was available, and that continued inquiries would be noted in Kale's file. The threat was implicit but unmistakable. To ask more questions would be to invite scrutiny, and scrutiny in the lower levels often led to conscription, detention, or worse. So Kale had stopped asking, but he had not stopped wondering, and the not knowing was eating him alive. He had gone to his brother's hab unit and found it sealed, the door welded shut and marked with the same warnings about structural instability that I had seen on other buildings. He had tried to locate his brother's wife and children, but had been told that they too had been relocated, destination unspecified, and that their records had been archived pending administrative review. They had all disappeared, erased from the official records as though they had never existed. I told him that I was sorry, because there was nothing else to say, and we returned to our work in silence, but his words stayed with me, echoing through my thoughts during the long hours of hauling and the brief periods of restless sleep. His brother had not been a criminal or a troublemaker. He had been a productive worker, exactly the kind of person the Imperium claimed to value, someone who contributed to the Hive's function and maintained the systems that kept millions alive. And yet he had disappeared as completely as if he had never existed, along with his entire family, and no one had investigated or even questioned the circumstances. The enforcers had offered only bureaucratic evasion and implicit threats, and the Administratum had simply updated its records to reflect 1 fewer registered worker and 4 fewer dependents. The realization settled over me like a weight, pressing down on my chest until breathing became difficult. I have always known, on some level, that life in the lower levels is precarious, that we exist at the sufferance of powers that do not care whether we live or die. But knowing something abstractly and confronting it directly are different experiences, and the difference is the space where denial can no longer exist. I had spent my entire life telling myself that if I worked hard, if I followed the rules, if I kept my head down and did not cause trouble, then I would be safe. Not comfortable, not happy, but safe. I had believed that the Imperium, for all its cruelty and indifference, operated according to some internal logic, that there were reasons behind the suffering, that the machine of governance, however vast and impersonal, recognized the value of its components and sought to preserve them when possible. I had been wrong. The Imperium does not value us. It consumes us, grinding us down until we are used up and then discarding us without thought or hesitation. We are not citizens in any meaningful sense. We are resources, no different from the promethium that fuels the generators or the ore that feeds the foundries, and when a resource becomes more costly to maintain than to replace, it is simply eliminated. The sealed hab blocks were not failures of administration or tragic accidents. They were deliberate, calculated decisions, the kind made every day across 1,000,000 worlds. And the people who made them never saw the faces of those they condemned, because distance makes all atrocity tolerable. To the planners in the upper hive, reviewing population density reports and resource distribution charts, we were numbers on a data slate, statistical abstractions that could be adjusted or eliminated with a few keystrokes. Our suffering was not cruelty, it was efficiency. I wanted to rage against this understanding, to reject it as paranoia or exaggeration, to find some flaw in the logic that would allow me to return to my previous state of willful ignorance. But I could not. The evidence was everywhere, written in the patterns of disappearance and the sealed doorways, in the silence of the enforcers and the nervous avoidance of my fellow haulers. And once I saw it, I could not unsee it. The knowledge sat in my chest like a stone, cold and heavy, and it colored every interaction and every observation with new significance. That night, I did something foolish. I left my HAB unit after curfew and made my way through the darkened corridors towards Sector 9 Gamma. Curfew violations are punishable by immediate detention and possible conscription into penal work details, and the enforcers patrol the lower levels with a frequency that makes avoidance difficult. But I had to see for myself, had to confirm what I already knew to be true. Because without confirmation, there remained the possibility of doubt, and doubt was the only comfort I had left. I moved carefully, keeping to the maintenance passages and service ducts that are too narrow for armored enforcers to navigate easily, spaces where the air is thick with toxic fumes and the walls are coated with slime that burns exposed skin. I had learned these routes as a child, exploring the hidden spaces of the Hive with other children who had nothing better to do and no adults to supervise them, and I remembered them now with a clarity born of desperation. The journey took over an hour, moving slowly and stopping frequently to listen for the heavy footfalls of patrol units or the mechanical whir of surveillance servitors. The lower levels at night are different from their daytime counterparts. The darkness is absolute in sections where the luminators have failed, and the sounds are amplified by the stillness, every drip of moisture and creak of settling ferrocrete echoing through empty corridors. I passed through residential sectors where families slept in their cramped HAB units, their snoring and breathing audible through the thin walls, and I passed through industrial zones where machinery ran continuously, tended by servitors and night shift workers who moved with the blank expressions of people who had long ago surrendered any hope of something better. Finally, I reached the boundary of Sector 9 Gamma. The entrance had been sealed with a heavy plasteel barrier, welded into place and marked with Imperial Aquilus and hazard warnings about structural collapse. But the seal was imperfect, and along the lower edge, where the barrier met the floor, there was a gap barely wide enough for a person to squeeze through if they were willing to contort themselves and risk injury. I hesitated, knowing that what I was about to do crossed a line that could not be uncrossed, that entering a sealed sector without authorization was a serious violation that would result in severe punishment if discovered. But I had come too far to turn back, and the need to know was stronger than my fear of consequences. I lay down on the filthy floor and began to work my way through the gap. The metal scraped against my back and chest, tearing through my coveralls and drawing blood from my skin, and for a moment I thought I would become stuck, trapped in a space too small to move forward or backward. The panic that seized me was absolute, a primal terror of being buried alive or crushed slowly by the weight of the Hive pressing down from above. But then I was through, pulling myself into the darkness beyond the seal, and I stood in the abandoned sector with my heart hammering against my ribs and my breath coming in short gasps. The smell hit me immediately, so strong that I gagged and pressed my arm over my nose and mouth. It was the same sweet, rotting smell I had noticed weeks earlier, but magnified 100-fold, thick enough to taste and so pervasive that it seemed to coat my skin. The air was hot and humid, like breathing inside a furnace, and I could hear the buzzing of flies, thousands of them, their droning filling the silence with a sound like distant machinery. I had brought a small luminator, the kind used by maintenance workers, and I activated it with shaking hands, sweeping the beam across the corridor ahead. What I saw made my blood turn cold. The corridor was filled with bodies. They lay in heaps against the walls and sprawled across the floor. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds, too many to count in the dim light. Some were clothed in the ragged coveralls of lower-level residents, others in the thin garments of children, and a few were so decomposed that I could not determine their age or identity. Their faces were twisted in expressions of pain and terror, mouths open in silent screams, hands clutching at throats or pressed against chests as though trying to hold something inside. There was no sign of violence, no wounds or blood, only the terrible stillness of mass death and the flies that swarmed in clouds above the corpses, their bodies glinting metallic green in the luminator beam. The bodies were in various stages of decomposition, some still recognizably human, others reduced to bloated, discolored masses that barely resembled their original forms. The heat and humidity had accelerated the process, turning the corridor into a charnel house where flesh rotted and liquefied, pooling on the floor in dark puddles that reflected my luminator beam with an oily sheen. I could see children among the dead, their small bodies crumpled in corners or clutched in the arms of adults who had tried to protect them in their final moments. I could see elderly people who had died sitting upright, their backs against the walls, as though they had simply given up and waited for the end to come. And I could see the younger adults, the workers and haulers and fabricators who should have been in their prime, their bodies testimony to the fact that strength and health offered no protection when the Imperium decided you were expendable. I do not know how long I stood there, frozen by horror and disbelief. Time seemed to distort, stretching and compressing until minutes felt like hours, and I could no longer trust my own perceptions. The luminator beam trembled as my hands shook, casting wild shadows across the walls, and I realized that I was looking at the remains of an entire community, people who had been sealed inside their homes and left to die. There was no mystery about what had happened. The plasteel barrier had been installed to prevent escape, and then the air circulation had been cut, suffocating everyone inside, or perhaps releasing some toxic gas that killed quickly and left no visible marks. It was efficient and cost-effective, requiring minimal resources and leaving no survivors to tell their stories or demand justice. I wanted to look away, to flee back through the gap and pretend that I had never seen this, but I could not move. My body would not obey me, locked in place by a horror so complete that it overwhelmed my survival instincts. And then, from somewhere deeper in the sector, I heard a sound that broke the spell and sent terror flooding through my veins. It was a scraping, rhythmic and deliberate, like metal dragging across stone. The sound grew louder, echoing through the silent corridors, and I finally broke free of my paralysis and ran. I did not think about what I was fleeing from or whether it was human or something worse. I only ran, sprinting through the darkness with the luminator clutched in one hand and my breath tearing through my throat, my feet splashing through the puddles of decomposition fluid and my shoulder scraping against walls when I took corners too quickly. Behind me, the scraping sound continued, maintaining its steady rhythm, neither accelerating nor slowing, and I had the terrible sense that whatever was making it did not need to hurry, that it knew I was trapped and that escape was only a temporary illusion. I reached the gap in the seal and threw myself through it with such force that I felt something in my shoulder tear, the pain sharp and immediate but insignificant compared to the need to get out. I pulled myself through and scrambled to my feet, not stopping to assess my injuries, and ran through the corridors toward my hab unit. I did not stop running until I reached my own door, where I collapsed on the floor and lay gasping while Mira stared at me with wide, frightened eyes. She could see the blood soaking through my coveralls and smell the stench of death that clung to my clothes, but she did not ask where I had been or what I had seen. She knew better than to ask questions whose answers would only bring danger. The next morning, I reported for my shift as though nothing had happened. What else could I do? There was no one to tell, no authority to whom I could report what I had seen, because the authorities were the ones responsible. The enforcers would not help me. They would arrest me for entering a sealed sector without authorization, and if I spoke about what I had witnessed, I would be marked as someone who possessed dangerous knowledge, someone who needed to be silenced. The Administratum would not investigate because they were the ones who had ordered the sealing in the first place, who had signed the work orders and allocated the resources to make it happen. And if I spoke openly about what I had witnessed, I would be marked as a dissident and would disappear just as surely as the people in Sector 9 Gamma had disappeared. So I said nothing, and I hauled waste with my team, and I tried to forget the sight of those bodies and the sound of scraping metal in the darkness. But forgetting was impossible. The images were burned into my mind, replaying endlessly whenever I closed my eyes or allowed my attention to wander. I saw the faces of the dead, their expressions of terror and agony, and I wondered who they had been, whether any of them had been friends of Cale's brother, whether any of them had known my father before he disappeared. I wondered if they had known what was coming, if they had heard the welders sealing the barrier and understood what it meant, or if death had taken them by surprise, a sudden betrayal by the Imperium they had served their entire lives. Over the following days, I began to watch the other residents of my hab block with new eyes, wondering who among them knew what I knew, who had seen what I had seen, and who had chosen silence just as I had. I looked for signs of shared understanding, some glimmer of recognition or solidarity, but I found nothing. Everyone went about their routines with the same dull resignation, the same exhausted compliance, and if they had questions or fears, they kept them hidden behind faces worn smooth by years of suppression. I wanted to shake them, to force them to see what was happening, to demand that they acknowledge the atrocity unfolding around us. But I knew that such an effort would be futile, because they already knew, they had always known. The difference was that they had accepted it, had internalized the lessons taught by a lifetime of cruelty, and had concluded that survival required the surrender of all hope. To fight was to die, and dying would not change anything. Better to keep your head down, to work your shifts, to collect your rations, and hope that when the consolidation came for your sector, you would be among the fortunate few deemed worthy of transfer rather than disposal. It was a rational calculation in its own way, the logic of people who had learned that the universe was fundamentally hostile and that the only measure of success was lasting one more day. I could not accept that. Not yet. I began to gather information, quietly and carefully, speaking to haulers from other teams during rest periods and listening to the conversations at the communal water stations. The water stations were one of the few places where residents from different hab blocks mingled, forced into proximity by the shared need for this essential resource, and the long queues created opportunities for conversation that would otherwise be impossible. I positioned myself near groups of workers from other sectors and listened as they spoke in low voices about their own experiences of disappearances and sealings. What I learned confirmed my worst suspicions and revealed that the scope of the consolidation was far larger than I had imagined. The consolidation was not limited to Sector 9 Gamma or even to my immediate area. It was happening across the entire lower level, a systematic reduction of the population that had been underway for months, perhaps longer, and that showed no signs of stopping. Entire residential zones were being depopulated, their inhabitants either relocated to Underhive labor camps or simply sealed inside their homes and forgotten. The official justification, when any was given, was structural instability. The claim that the ancient ferrocrete foundations could no longer support the weight of habitation and that evacuation was necessary for safety. But the evacuations were not evacuations at all. They were purges, carefully planned and ruthlessly executed, designed to reduce the burden on the Hive's infrastructure by eliminating those deemed least essential, and we, the residents of the lower levels, were the least essential of all. The Imperium measures value in productivity, and by that measure, we produce almost nothing. We are not soldiers or fabricators, not administrators or tech priests, not merchants or artisans. We haul waste and maintain the systems that keep the Hive functioning, work that is necessary but easily replaced, and our existence consumes resources that could be allocated elsewhere. From the perspective of some distant planner, reviewing population density reports and resource distribution charts, the decision to reduce our numbers is not cruel. It is simply logical, a necessary optimization, the kind of choice that must be made when governing an empire that spans 1,000,000 worlds and encompasses trillions of souls. The individual suffering caused by such decisions is irrelevant because individuals, in the calculus of the Imperium, do not matter. Only the machine matters, the vast, grinding engine of governance and war that perpetuates itself across centuries, and we are simply grist for that machine, fed into its mechanisms and ground down until nothing remains. This understanding did not bring me peace. It brought only rage, a burning anger that sat in my chest like molten metal, searing everything it touched. But rage alone accomplishes nothing. It can motivate action, but without direction or strategy, it simply consumes the person who feels it, burning them up from the inside until nothing remains but ash and bitterness. I needed to channel the rage into something productive, to find some way of striking back at the system that had condemned us to this existence. But what could one person do against the Imperium? What power did I have to resist an institution that commanded armies of billions and ruled over 1,000,000 worlds? The answer seemed obvious. I had no power at all, but perhaps power was not what I needed. Perhaps what I needed was simply to refuse to accept the narrative that the Imperium imposed, the story that our suffering was necessary and just, that we deserved our fate because we were lesser beings, that obedience and submission were virtues rather than survival mechanisms born of terror. If I could not change the system, perhaps I could at least change how people thought about it, could plant seeds of doubt and resistance that might grow into something larger. It was a small hope, fragile and easily crushed, but it was better than the alternative, which was to accept that nothing could be done and that we were simply doomed to endure until the consolidation reached our hab block and we too were sealed away or marched off to labor camps from which there was no return. I decided that I would try to warn people, to organize some kind of response or resistance, even though I knew the attempt was likely futile. I started with my own hab block, speaking quietly to neighbors during the evening hours when the enforcer patrols were lightest. I chose my targets carefully, focusing on younger residents who had not yet been completely ground down by years of oppression, people who still showed some spark of anger or curiosity. I told them what I had seen in Sector 9 Gamma, described the bodies and the sealed entrances, and explained that the consolidation was coming for us, that our sector would be next if we did nothing. I expected shock, outrage, perhaps fear that would galvanize action. Instead, I found apathy and denial. Most people refused to believe me, dismissing my account as paranoid fantasy or the delusions of someone broken by the work. They cited the official explanations about structural instability and insisted that the Administratum would never deliberately harm productive workers, that such actions would undermine the Hive's function and therefore could not be true. Their faith in the system was absolute, not because they loved the Imperium or believed in its righteousness, but because the alternative was too terrifying to contemplate. If the Imperium could and would kill them without cause or justification, then there was no safety anywhere, no rules that could be followed to ensure survival, and that uncertainty was more frightening than any specific threat. Others listened but shrugged and said that there was nothing to be done, that resistance would only bring punishment, and that if the Imperium had decided to reduce the population, then that decision was final. These were the realists, people who had seen enough of life in the lower levels to understand how power worked and who had concluded that the only rational response to overwhelming force was submission. They did not disagree with my assessment of the situation. They simply believed that acknowledging the truth changed nothing, that we were powerless to affect our circumstances, and that the best strategy was to make oneself as inconspicuous as possible and hope to be overlooked when the purges came. A few became angry, not at the Imperium, but at me, accusing me of spreading seditious lies and threatening to report me to the enforcers if I did not stop. These were the collaborators, people who had internalized the Imperium's values so completely that they saw any criticism of the system as a personal attack, who believed that their own suffering was justified and that anyone who questioned it was dangerous and needed to be silenced. Some of them, I knew, were informants who received small rewards for reporting suspicious activity, but others were simply true believers, people who had constructed their entire identity around loyalty to the Imperium and who could not tolerate any challenge to that foundation without feeling that their lives had been wasted in service to a lie. Their responses baffled me at first, and then I understood. They were afraid, yes, but it was not the kind of fear that motivates action. It was the fear of someone who has been beaten so thoroughly and so often that they no longer believe escape is possible, who has learned that resistance brings only greater suffering, and who has concluded that the safest path is submission. They had been conditioned, over generations, to accept that the Imperium's will is absolute and that their role is to obey without question. To resist, in their minds, was not heroic. It was suicide. And they had families to think of, children who depended on their ration chips and HAB unit assignments, and the knowledge that any act of defiance would result not only in their own deaths, but in the deaths of everyone connected to them. So they chose to disbelieve, to pretend that the danger was not real, or that it would somehow pass them by, because the alternative was a terror too great to bear. I could not blame them for this choice, even as I despised it, because I understood that they were doing what they believed was necessary to protect themselves and their loved ones. The Imperium had created a system where solidarity was impossible, where any form of collective action was immediately crushed, and where the safest strategy was to isolate oneself and avoid drawing attention. In such an environment, asking people to resist was asking them to sacrifice not only themselves but everyone they cared about, and that was a burden too heavy for most people to carry. I could not blame them, but I could not join them either. My efforts to organize met with similar resistance across the HAB block, and after a week of trying, I realized that I was accomplishing nothing except drawing attention to myself. The enforcers had begun to patrol our corridors more frequently, and I noticed that certain neighbors no longer made eye contact with me, a sure sign that someone had reported my activities. My name had likely been added to one of the lists that the enforcers maintained, databases of potentially problematic individuals who required monitoring. Once on such a list, removal was nearly impossible, and the consequences ranged from increased scrutiny to outright conscription into penal work details. I decided to stop my organizing efforts, not because I had given up, but because continuing would only ensure my own death without achieving anything meaningful. If the people of the lower levels would not fight for themselves, then I could not fight for them. All I could do was try to save myself and Mira, to find some way of escaping the consolidation before it reached our sector. But how does one escape the lower levels of a hive city when every exit is monitored and every movement tracked? The upper levels were sealed off by security checkpoints that required proper identification and authorization, and anyone attempting to pass without the correct credentials would be arrested immediately. The Underhive offered no refuge, only toxic wastes and lawless gangs that preyed on anyone foolish enough to venture into their territory. And the sump levels below, even that were a death sentence, flooded with chemical runoff and inhabited by things that had adapted to the poison until they became poison themselves. The answer, I realized with growing despair, was that one does not escape. The lower levels are not a prison because they have walls and guards, though they have those too. They are a prison because leaving requires resources that the residents do not possess, because every potential exit is controlled by authorities who have no interest in allowing movement, and because the alternative destinations are often worse than the place one is fleeing. We are trapped not by physical barriers but by economics and geography, by the simple fact that we have nowhere else to go and no means of getting there even if we did. One only chooses the manner of one's ending. The consolidation reached our sector 2 weeks later. It began with an announcement broadcast through the HAB block Vox system, a crackling, distorted voice that instructed all residents to report to the Central Assembly area for mandatory processing. The announcement provided no explanation, no details about what processing entailed, only the assurance that compliance was required and failure to comply would result in immediate sanction. The Vox message repeated every hour throughout the day, and each time it played, I felt the knot in my stomach tighten. I knew what was coming. I had seen it in Sector 9 Gamma, and I understood that the announcement was simply a formality, a way of maintaining the fiction that the Imperium followed proper procedure even as it prepared to dispose of us. That evening, enforcers arrived in force. They came in squads of 10, armored in the black carapace plates that marked them as security specialists, carrying shock mauls and autoguns and wearing helmets with mirrored visors that concealed their faces. They moved through the HAB block systematically, sealing exits and establishing checkpoints at every intersection, and their presence transformed the building from a place of quiet desperation into a prison. Residents who tried to leave were turned back, sometimes with violence, and those who questioned the enforcers were struck down without warning, their bodies left in the corridors as examples. The message was clear and unambiguous. We were to comply, or we were to die, and the choice was ours to make. The processing began the next morning, conducted with the mechanical efficiency that characterized all administratum operations. Residents were called by Hab unit number and instructed to gather their possessions and report to the assembly area, where administratum officials reviewed identification tattoos and updated population records. The assembly area was a large common space on the ground level of our Hab block, normally used for the distribution of rations and the posting of official notices, but now transformed into a sorting facility. The officials sat at makeshift desks, their data slates glowing in the dim light, and they worked with the same bored indifference they might show when cataloging shipments of grain or ammunition. Those who complied were sorted into groups and marched away under enforcer guard, disappearing into the lower levels toward destinations that were never specified. I watched from my Hab unit window as families were separated, children torn from parents, elderly residents dragged away when they could not walk quickly enough. The enforcers showed no emotion, no hesitation, simply executing their orders with mechanical efficiency that suggested they had performed this task many times before. Some residents tried to resist, clinging to family members or refusing to move, and these individuals were beaten until they complied or became unconscious, at which point they were carried away on stretchers operated by servitors. The servitors moved through the assembly area like automatons, their dead eyes staring at nothing, their augmetic limbs performing their programmed functions with perfect precision. Some of them had once been human, I realized, looking at the surgical scars and the patches of preserved flesh visible beneath their mechanical components. Perhaps some of them had even been residents of this very Hab block, people who had been processed in previous consolidations and repurposed into the tools that now facilitated the processing of others. The thought was nauseating, a reminder that even death offered no escape from service to the Imperium, that our bodies would be used and reused until they literally fell apart. When our Hab unit number was called, Mira looked at me with eyes that held no hope, only a terrible resignation. She was 12 years old, and she understood that we were about to die. I wanted to tell her that everything would be all right, that I would protect her, that we would find a way to survive this. But I could not lie to her, could not offer false comfort when she needed truth, however terrible that truth might be. So instead, I took her hand and led her toward the assembly area, moving slowly through corridors that had become unfamiliar, transformed by fear and the presence of armed men into something alien and hostile. The corridors were crowded with other residents making the same journey, all of us moving in the same direction like livestock being herded to slaughter. No one spoke. The only sounds were footsteps and the occasional sob from someone who had finally broken under the weight of accumulated terror. I held Mira's hand tightly, feeling how small and fragile it was, and I tried to memorize every detail of her presence, knowing that these might be our final moments together. She did not cry or complain, simply walked beside me with a dignity that made my heart ache, and I wondered what thoughts were running through her mind, whether she blamed me for failing to protect her, or whether she understood that I had done everything I could, and that sometimes everything is not enough. At the assembly area, we joined a line of residents waiting to be processed. The line moved slowly, shuffling forward at the pace dictated by the officials conducting the sorting, and as we waited, I had time to observe what was happening at the front. The administratum officials were conducting a triage of sorts, separating residents into 3 groups based on criteria that were never explained but became clear through observation. The first group consisted of young, healthy individuals who appeared capable of performing physical labor. These were marked with blue ink on their foreheads, a crude but effective method of categorization, and directed to one side of the room where enforcers kept them under close guard. The second group was made up of children, elderly, and those too sick or injured to work effectively. These were marked with red ink and directed to another area, and watching them, I understood that red meant disposal, that these people were being separated out for immediate termination because they could not contribute to the Hive's productivity and therefore had no value to the Imperium. The third group, the smallest, consisted of those who possessed specialized skills or training that made them more valuable than common laborers. These were marked with green ink and segregated from the others, likely destined for reassignment to positions where their expertise could be exploited more effectively. I was marked with blue. Mira was marked with red. The official who processed us was a thin man with an augmetic eye that whirred and clicked as it focused on our identification tattoos, the mechanical lens dilating and contracting as it scanned the barcodes etched into our skin. He reviewed our records on a battered data slate, made notations with a stylus, and then waved us toward our respective groups without a word. His face showed no emotion, no recognition that he was sentencing a 12-year-old child to death, and I realized that he probably processed hundreds of people per day and had long ago ceased to see them as individuals. We were simply data points, entries in a database that needed to be updated, and the emotional content of those updates was irrelevant to his function. I tried to hold onto Mira's hand to refuse the separation, but an enforcer stepped forward and struck me across the face with his shock maul. The pain was immediate and overwhelming, a cascade of electrical agony that shut down my nervous system and sent me crashing to the floor. I could not breathe, could not move, could only lie there gasping while the world spun around me and my vision filled with bright spots that pulsed in time with my heartbeat. When I could see again, Mira was being led away, her small form disappearing into the crowd of red-marked residents, and I screamed her name until another blow from the shock maul silenced me. I was dragged to the blue-marked group and thrown into a corner, where I lay curled on the filthy floor and tried not to vomit from the pain radiating through my skull. My face felt like it was on fire, the skin blistered and raw where the shock maul had made contact, and I could taste blood in my mouth where I had bitten through my tongue. Around me, other residents sat or stood in various states of shock and despair, some weeping silently, others staring at nothing with empty eyes. We were not allowed to speak, and the enforcers patrolled the perimeter of our group with weapons drawn, ready to respond to any sign of resistance. Hours passed, or maybe only minutes, time losing all meaning in the airless, overcrowded space, and then we were ordered to stand and form a line. We were marched out of the assembly area and into the corridors beyond, moving in single file under heavy guard. No one told us where we were going, and no one asked. We descended through levels I had never seen, passing through checkpoints manned by heavily armed security teams, and traversing passages carved from raw stone rather than ferrocrete. The architecture changed as we descended, becoming more primitive and industrial, with exposed pipes and cables running along the walls and floors that were simply bare rock worn smooth by centuries of foot traffic. The air grew hotter and more oppressive with each level we descended, and the walls began to glow with a dull red heat that suggested proximity to the Hive's geothermal core. The sound of machinery grew louder, a constant grinding and hammering that vibrated through the floor and made my teeth ache. I could hear the roar of furnaces and the hiss of steam vents, and I realized that we were being taken to the Underhive, to the industrial zones where the Hive's most dangerous and toxic work was performed. These were the places that produced the materials and energy that sustained the Hive above, the foundries and refineries and chemical processors that operated continuously, consuming resources and workers with equal indifference. The workers in these facilities had the shortest life expectancies in the entire Hive, measured in months rather than years, and they were constantly being replenished with fresh conscripts as the old ones died from exposure, accidents, or simple physical collapse. We emerged into a vast chamber lit by the orange glow of molten metal and filled with machines so large that they seemed to touch the ceiling kilometers above. The scale of the space was overwhelming, designed for industrial processes rather than human comfort, and the heat was like walking into a wall. I could feel my skin beginning to blister within seconds, and the air was so dry that each breath felt like inhaling sand. Conveyor belts carried loads of raw ore and scrap metal toward massive crushers and smelters, and human workers, stripped to the waist and covered in burns and scars, labored alongside servitors to feed the machines. The noise was so loud that communication was impossible except through hand signals, and the workers moved with mechanical precision, their actions synchronized to the rhythm of the machines. This was a labor camp, one of the thousands that existed throughout the Underhive, and it was here that the blue-marked residents would spend the remainder of their lives, however short that might be, working until they collapsed from exhaustion or injury and were replaced by the next batch of conscripts. An overseer, a massive man with augmetic limbs and a voice amplified by a voxcaster, assigned us to work teams and directed us toward different sections of the facility. His augmetics were crude and functional rather than elegant. Heavy hydraulic pistons and reinforced joints that gave him the appearance of a walking industrial machine, and his voice boomed across the chamber with enough volume to be heard over the roar of the furnaces. I was sent to a sorting station, where my task was to separate recyclable materials from waste before the mixture was fed into the crushers. The work required constant attention and quick reflexes, because the conveyor belt moved at a pace designed for servitors rather than humans, and the materials passing by included sharp metal fragments, toxic chemicals, and occasionally unexploded ordnance that had somehow made it through the collection process. Other workers stood at stations along the conveyor, their hands moving in constant motion as they grabbed items and threw them into different chutes based on categorization protocols that had been drilled into them during a brief and inadequate orientation period. The work was grueling and dangerous, requiring constant vigilance to avoid losing fingers or hands to the fast-moving conveyors or being splashed by corrosive liquids. The heat was so intense that I felt my skin blistering within the first hour, and sweat poured from my body at a rate that would quickly lead to dehydration if not addressed. But there were no breaks, no water, no relief from the relentless pace of the machines, and the overseers responded to any sign of slowing with shock prods and beatings. I worked until my vision blurred and my legs gave out, and when I collapsed, I was dragged to the side by a servitor and left to recover on my own before being forced back to the line. This continued for days, or perhaps weeks. I lost track of time, each shift blending into the next in an endless cycle of pain and exhaustion. Sleep came in brief, fitful intervals on hard metal floors that radiated heat from the processes below, and food was distributed once per shift, thin gruel that tasted of chemicals and provided barely enough calories to sustain the work. Around me, other conscripts died with grim regularity, succumbing to heat stroke, toxic exposure, or simple physical collapse, and their bodies were dragged away by servitors and dumped into the incinerators without ceremony. No one mourned them. No one even remembered their names. They were simply gone, erased from existence as though they had never been, and the rest of us continued working because to stop was to join them. The other workers in my section rarely spoke, their exhaustion too complete to allow for conversation, but during the brief rest periods, I sometimes caught fragments of their stories. There was a woman named Kessa who had been a textile worker before the consolidation, who spoke in whispers about the daughter she had lost during processing, marked with red ink and taken away. There was a man named Torvald who had been a machinist, whose hands were so damaged by acid burns that he could barely grip the materials he was supposed to sort, but who continued working because the alternative was immediate execution. There was a boy younger than Kale whose name I never learned, who cried silently during the shifts, and who died on my third day when he lost his balance and fell into one of the crushers, his scream cut short by the grinding of massive gears. I thought constantly of Mira, wondering what had happened to her, whether she was still alive or whether she had been among those sealed in a hab block and left to die or simply executed and incinerated. The uncertainty was worse than knowing would have been, because it left room for hope, and hope in such circumstances is a form of torture. I imagined scenarios where she had somehow escaped, where she had been overlooked or misclassified and was still living in the hab block, waiting for me to return. But I knew these fantasies were lies. I told myself to avoid confronting the truth, which was that she was dead, that the red mark on her forehead had been a death sentence, and that I would never see her again. The rage I had felt earlier, the burning need for justice or revenge, had faded, replaced by a hollow numbness that made even despair feel distant and abstract. The labor camp had a way of grinding down everything that made a person human, reducing them to basic biological functions and survival instincts. I no longer thought about resistance or organizing or bearing witness. I thought only about surviving the next shift, about finding enough water to prevent fatal dehydration, about keeping my hands steady enough to avoid injury. I had become what the Imperium wanted me to be, a tool, unthinking and obedient, existing only to serve the machine until I was used up and discarded. But then something unexpected happened that pierced through the numbness and reminded me that I was still capable of feeling. A riot broke out in the northern section of the facility. A spontaneous uprising triggered when an overseer executed a worker for refusing an order. I did not witness the initial incident, but I heard about it from other workers during a shift change, passed along in whispers despite the prohibition on conversation. The executed worker had been a young man named Deneth, who had collapsed from heat exhaustion and been unable to return to his station. The overseer had ordered him to get up and continue working, and when Deneth could not comply, the overseer had simply shot him in the head with a stub pistol and ordered servitors to remove the body. But something about this particular execution had been different. Perhaps it was the casual nature of the killing, performed without even the pretense of justification or due process. Perhaps it was simply that Deneth had been well liked by his fellow workers, known for sharing his meager food rations with those who were struggling. Whatever the reason, the other workers in his section had responded not with the usual resignation but with fury. They had attacked the overseer, overwhelming him through sheer numbers and beating him to death with pieces of scrap metal before the enforcers could respond. From there, the violence had spread, workers seizing weapons from fallen guards and attacking the machinery that had consumed so many of their comrades. The riot raged for hours, filling the chamber with screams and the sound of autogun fire. I watched from my sorting station as bodies fell from the upper gantries and machines were set ablaze, the flames casting wild shadows across the walls and adding to the infernal atmosphere. The workers fought with desperate courage, using improvised weapons and their own bodies as shields, and for a brief moment, it seemed as though they might actually succeed in taking control of the facility. But the Imperium's response was inevitable and overwhelming. Enforcer reinforcements arrived in force, supported by combat servitors and armed with flamers and heavy stubbers, and they methodically crushed the uprising with tactics honed through centuries of suppressing rebellion. The workers had no training, no coordination, no supply lines or strategic objectives. They had only rage and the desire to strike back at their oppressors, and that was not enough. Within a day, the uprising was over, the survivors rounded up and executed in full view of the remaining workers as a lesson in the consequences of defiance. The executions were conducted publicly and methodically, the condemned lined up against a wall and shot one at a time while the rest of us were forced to watch. The enforcers made no speeches, offered no justifications, simply carried out their orders with mechanical efficiency until all the rebels were dead and their bodies had been fed into the incinerators. But for a brief moment, watching those desperate people fight back against their oppressors, I had remembered what it felt like to believe that resistance was possible, that the Imperium's power was not absolute, and that even in the face of overwhelming force, human beings could choose to stand rather than submit. The memory of that feeling sustained me through the days that followed, a small ember of defiance that had not been completely extinguished by the labor camp's grinding routine. I began to think, slowly and carefully, about what I might do, what small act of resistance might be possible even in this place where all agency had been stripped away. I could not escape the labor camp. The facility was sealed and heavily guarded, and even if I somehow made it past the enforcers, I would simply die in the toxic wastes of the Underhive, where the air itself was poison, and the gangs that controlled the territory showed no mercy to outsiders. I could not save Mira. She was already gone, and no amount of wishful thinking would change that fact. But I could do one thing, one small act that would have no practical effect but that might preserve some fragment of meaning in a world that seemed designed to strip meaning away. I could bear witness. The idea came to me during a shift, as I stood at my sorting station with my hands moving automatically and my mind wandering through memories of the lower levels. I thought about the sealed hab blocks and the bodies left to rot, about the families torn apart during processing and the casual cruelty of the Administratum officials. I thought about Kale's brother and my father and all the countless others who had disappeared without record or remembrance, their lives erased as though they had never mattered. And I realized that the greatest victory the Imperium claimed was not its military might or its technological superiority, but its ability to make people believe that their suffering was inevitable and meaningless, that nothing could be done, that resistance was futile, and therefore not worth attempting. But what if that belief was wrong? What if the very act of remembering, of refusing to forget, was itself a form of resistance? What if bearing witness to the atrocities, even when that witness could not prevent them or bring justice to the perpetrators, was still valuable because it denied the Imperium's narrative of inevitability and affirmed that the victims had mattered, that their lives had possessed value, even if that value was not recognized by the systems that destroyed them? I began to tell stories to the other conscripts during the brief rest periods, speaking quietly to avoid attracting the overseer's attention. I told them about the lower levels, about the communities that had existed there and the people who had lived and died in obscurity. I told them about Sector 9 Gamma and the bodies I had seen, about the consolidation and the systematic elimination of those deemed expendable. I told them about Mira and my father and Kale's brother, giving names and faces to the abstract numbers that the Imperium used to justify its atrocities. And I asked them to remember, to hold these stories in their minds and pass them on to others, so that even when we were gone, some record of our existence would remain. Some refused to listen, too broken or too afraid to engage with anything that might bring punishment. The labor camp had destroyed their capacity for anything beyond immediate survival, and they viewed my storytelling as a dangerous indulgence that might draw unwanted attention from the overseers. But others listened, and a few even began to share their own stories, speaking of the homes they had lost and the loved ones they would never see again. These stories were fragmentary and often incoherent, shaped by exhaustion and trauma. But they were precious because they represented the last evidence that these people had been more than numbers in a database, that they had possessed identities and relationships and hopes before the Imperium ground them down to raw material. The stories spread through the facility, passed from one conscript to another in whispers and fragments during shift changes and rest periods. They became a kind of resistance, a refusal to let the Imperium's narrative go unchallenged, a assertion that the victims of the consolidation had mattered and that their erasure was not inevitable or justified, but was instead a crime that demanded acknowledgement. It was not much. It changed nothing about our circumstances, did not slow the machines or reduce the suffering or bring back the dead. But it was something, and in a place where nothing seemed possible, even the smallest act of defiance carried meaning. I do not know how long I survived in the labor camp. Time became meaningless, measured only by shifts and rations and the slow deterioration of my body. My hands grew twisted with scar tissue, the skin hardened and cracked from repeated burns and cuts, and several of my fingers had lost sensation entirely. My lungs filled with toxic particulates, making each breath a struggle, and I developed a persistent cough that produced black phlegm flecked with blood. My mind began to fray at the edges, reality blurring into hallucination during the worst moments, and I sometimes lost track of whether I was at my sorting station or back in the lower levels or somewhere else entirely. I knew that I was dying, that the work was killing me by degrees, and that soon I would collapse and be dragged to the incinerators like so many others. But I was not afraid. I had come to understand that death, in the context of the Imperium, was not the worst fate. The worst fate was to live without meaning, to be reduced to a function, to forget that one had ever been human. Death would be a release, an end to suffering, and perhaps in whatever came after, if anything came after, I would be reunited with Mira and my father and all the others who had been taken from me. One day, during a shift, an overseer approached me and ordered me to follow him. I obeyed, too exhausted to question or resist, and he led me through the facility to a section I had never seen before, a clean, well-lit corridor that seemed to belong to a different world entirely. We entered a small room where an administratum official sat behind a desk, reviewing data on a holoscreen that projected columns of numbers and symbols I did not understand. The official looked up as I entered, his expression one of mild irritation, and gestured for me to stand before him. He consulted his data slate, verified my identification tattoo with a handheld scanner, and then informed me that I had been selected for transfer to a new assignment. He did not specify what the assignment was or where it would take me, only that I was to report to a transport dock within the hour. and that failure to comply would result in immediate termination. His tone suggested that he did not particularly care which option I chose, that both outcomes were equally acceptable from his perspective, and I understood that I was simply being moved from one form of exploitation to another. I was too tired to feel anything, not hope or fear or even curiosity. I simply nodded and allowed myself to be escorted from the room by an enforcer who gripped my arm with enough force to leave bruises. The transport dock was located at the edge of the facility, a vast platform where heavy cargo lifters descended from the upper levels to collect materials and deliver supplies. The lifters were enormous industrial vehicles, capable of carrying hundreds of tons, and they arrived and departed with mechanical regularity, serviced by crews of workers and servitors who moved with practiced efficiency. I was placed in a group of 20 conscripts, all of whom looked as broken and worn as I felt, and we were loaded into the back of a transport container with no explanation. The container was a simple metal box with no windows or ventilation, and once we were inside, the doors were sealed, plunging us into darkness. We sat in the darkness, pressed against one another in the cramped space, and waited. No one spoke. What was there to say? We were being moved from one place of suffering to another, and speculation about our destination seemed pointless when we had no power to affect it. Then we felt the lurch of movement as the lifter began to ascend, rising through the levels of the hive with a speed that made my stomach drop and my ears pop from the changing pressure. We rose for what seemed like hours, the temperature gradually cooling and the air becoming less toxic, and I allowed myself to imagine, just for a moment, that we were being returned to the lower levels, that some mistake had been made, and we were being released. But when the container opened, we were not in the lower levels. We were in a processing facility, a clinical white space filled with medical servitors and robed figures I recognized as members of the Adeptus Mechanicus. The air was cool and clean, filtered through systems that removed all contaminants, and the lighting was bright and steady, so different from the hellish environment of the labor camp that it took my eyes several minutes to adjust. We were lined up against a wall and examined by servitors equipped with medical scanners, their mechanical appendages moving across our bodies with impersonal efficiency, and then we were separated into smaller groups based on criteria that were never explained. I was placed in a group of 5, and we were led into a surgical chamber where restraints were bolted to metal tables. The chamber was spotlessly clean, the walls lined with cabinets containing surgical instruments and chemical vials, and the air smelled of disinfectant and machine oil. Only then, seeing the tools and the tech priests preparing their equipment, did I understand what the new assignment was. We were being converted into servitors, our minds wiped and our bodies augmented with mechanical components, transformed from humans into tools that would serve the Imperium until our biological components failed entirely. The realization brought a clarity I had not felt in weeks, and with it came a strange sense of peace. This was the final stage, the endpoint of the journey that had begun when my father disappeared and I inherited his ration chip. I had been reduced, step by step, from a person with hopes and dreams to a laborer, from a laborer to a conscript, and now from a conscript to raw material for the Imperium's machines. It was fitting, in a way, that the process would end here, with the erasure of everything that had made me human, because it reflected the truth that I had learned over these long, terrible months. The Imperium does not value humanity. It consumes it, grinding it down into components that can be used and reused until nothing recognizable remains. But as the tech priests prepared their instruments and the servitors moved to secure me to the table, I spoke. My voice was hoarse and weak, barely more than a whisper, damaged by months of inhaling toxic fumes and screaming over the roar of machinery, but I spoke anyway. I told the story of Sector 9 Gamma and the sealed hab blocks, of Mira and Kale and all the others who had been erased. I spoke even as the restraints closed around my wrists and ankles, cold metal biting into my skin. Even as the tech priests injected sedatives into my bloodstream, their needles sliding into veins with practiced precision, even as my vision began to fade and darkness closed in around me. I spoke because it was the last thing I could do, the final act of resistance available to me, and because I needed to believe that someone, somewhere, might hear and remember. I do not know if anyone listened. The tech priests showed no reaction, continuing their work with mechanical efficiency, and the servitors, being incapable of independent thought, simply executed their programmed functions. But I spoke the words anyway, releasing them into the universe in the hope that they might survive even if I did not, that somewhere in the vast machinery of the Imperium, there might be someone